The champagne bottle shattered against the newly varnished posts, sending tiny glass shards dancing across the pristine dock. Eleanor Harrington released a practiced laugh as cameras flashed, capturing the moment for the Harbor Bay Gazette. Behind her, the Harrington family. Husband Richard in his navy blazer with the gold buttons, son Preston looking bored in boat shoes, and daughter Avery typing furiously on her phone, posed with tight smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. With this christening, we officially welcome the Harrington Pier to Harbor Bay, Eleanor announced, her voice carrying across the still waters of the cove. A place where our community can come together and enjoy the natural beauty of our town. What Eleanor didn't mention in her speech was that until 6 months ago, this 100-foot stretch of waterfront had been public property for over 70 years. The small coastal town of Harbor Bay, Connecticut, had managed its municipal dock since 1953, providing residents access to the water regardless of their address or income. That was until the Harringtons, who owned the adjacent estate and commercial properties throughout the town, had convinced the financially struggling town council to privatize the waterfront through a series of closed-door meetings and promises of revitalization. Frank Daniels watched the ceremony from his weathered Boston whaler anchored just beyond the no-wake zone. At 68, his face was a topographical map of decades spent on the water, first as a commercial fisherman, then as the owner of Harbor Bay's oldest charter service. He lowered his binoculars and shook his head. "I'll be damned," he muttered to his grandson, Jake, who sat beside him cleaning fishing gear. Third generation of Harringtons trying to own everything they see. Jake, 26, and recently returned to Harbor Bay after a failed attempt at city life in Boston, looked up from the tangled fishing line in his hands. "I still don't understand how they got away with it, Gramps. Half the town practically lived on that dock during summers. Money talks, kid, and the Harringtons never stopped talking." Frank spat over the side of the boat. Richard's grandfather tried buying the waterfront back in the 50s. His father tried again in the 80s. Now they've finally done it. Private-public partnership. They're calling it. The fine print of the deal allowed the Harringtons to control access to the waterfront in exchange for maintenance costs and promised upgrades. The community access Eleanor preached about in her speech actually meant scheduled hours, membership fees, and a list of regulations longer than the town charter itself. Across the water, Eleanor concluded her speech to polite applause from the gathered crowd, mostly town officials, business associates, and Harbor Bay's upper crust who had received personal invitations. The rest of the town's residents were supposedly welcome to attend the grand opening scheduled for the following weekend, where they could learn about the new membership options for accessing what had once been theirs by birthright. Frank started the engine of his boat, the familiar rumble masking his words from everyone except Jake. "Let's get out of here before I say something I'll regret." As they pulled away, neither noticed the dark clouds gathering on the distant horizon, nor the small group of longtime Harbor Bay residents watching silently from the public beach half a mile down the shore. Among them stood Maeve Sullivan, former town council member who had voted against the privatization, clutching a folder of legal documents and weather reports, a determined expression hardening her features. Back at the dock, Eleanor posed for one final photo of the architectural plans for Phase 2, a private marina with slips exclusively for luxury vessels, rolled neatly under her arm. Behind her perfect smile lay visions of the Harrington name on every inch of Harbor Bay's shoreline. What she couldn't see was how quickly those dreams would begin to unravel, starting with the nor'easter that meteorologists were tracking for landfall in just under 72 hours. Mayor Tom Wilson's phone rang at 4:37 a.m., 3 days after the Harrington Pier dedication. The harbor master's gravelly voice on the other end held none of its usual calm. "Tom, you need to get down here. Now." 20 minutes later, the mayor stood at the edge of what remained of the public beach access point, rain pelting his inadequate windbreaker as he stared in disbelief at Harbor Bay's transformed waterfront. The nor'easter had arrived with unexpected ferocity, its storm surge coinciding perfectly with the spring high tide. Waves crashed over the newly installed Harrington Pier signage and the custom teak benches, each with a small brass plaque bearing the names of founding members, bobbed like corks in the churning water. "Jesus," the mayor muttered, wiping rain from his face. "How bad is the structural damage?" The harbor master, Cal Jenkins, pointed toward the water with his flashlight. "The main supports are compromised. The whole south section is already gone. And look," his light beam shifted to where several luxury boats had broken free from their moorings, one now lodged sideways against what remained of the dock. "That's Richard Harrington's new Hinckley. Hit the dock like a battering ram when its line snapped." Mayor Wilson felt a headache forming behind his eyes. The Harringtons would expect immediate action, immediate resources, but the storm had affected the entire town. Power lines down, roads flooded, the retirement community on the north side evacuated. And it wasn't over yet. His phone buzzed with an incoming call, Richard Harrington. The mayor let it go to voicemail, By sunrise, the winds had subsided enough for a proper assessment. The Harrington Pier was a splintered skeleton of its former self. 2 days and nearly $5 million of revitalization gone overnight. What no one mentioned, though several longtime residents exchanged knowing glances, was that the old municipal dock had weathered similar storms for decades with minimal damage. Something about the Harrington's sleek redesign, with its emphasis on aesthetics over durability, had proven catastrophically unsuited to the realities of New England coastal weather. At 9 a.m., Eleanor and Richard Harrington arrived in matching hunter rain boots and Barber jackets, their Range Rover navigating through flooded streets to reach the waterfront. Eleanor's perfectly composed facade crumbled as she took in the destruction. "This is completely unacceptable," Richard boomed at the exhausted mayor. "Where were the emergency preparations? Why wasn't our property protected?" Mayor Wilson, who had been awake for nearly 30 hours straight managing the town's crisis response, felt something snap inside him. "Your property? This dock was built with a combination of public funds and private investment. And speaking of, the design you insisted on using against the harbor master's recommendations, I might add, was never rated for our coastal conditions." Eleanor stepped between them, her voice low and urgent. "Tom, this isn't productive. We need to focus on immediate repair and restoration. The grand opening is scheduled for next weekend." The mayor laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Eleanor, look around you. Half the town is underwater. The elementary school gym is full of displaced seniors. The grand opening is the least of our concerns right now." "We have a contract," Richard interjected, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Marcus." Marcus Whitfield was the Harrington's attorney, a Harvard-educated shark who had drafted the privatization agreement. While this confrontation unfolded, another scene was taking place half a mile away at Harbor Bay's public library, one of the few buildings with emergency power. In the community room, Maeve Sullivan stood before 30 residents, many still in their rain gear, water pooling beneath their boots on the industrial carpet. "The emergency amendment to the town charter is clear," she explained, pointing to the projected document on the wall. "In times of declared emergency, all private-public infrastructure reverts to municipal control for the duration of the crisis." Frank Daniels, sitting in the front row beside his grandson, raised his hand. "And the dock qualifies?" Maeve nodded, her expression grim but satisfied. Section 12, paragraph 3 specifically includes any water access points jointly funded by municipal resources. The Harringtons used a town tax credit to finance 30% of the construction. I made sure that language was preserved when they pushed through the privatization. Jake leaned toward his grandfather. "So what does this mean?" Frank's weathered face broke into its first genuine smile in months. "It means, kid, that for the next few weeks at least, that dock belongs to Harbor Bay again. What's left of it, anyway." Back at the waterfront, the mayor's phone rang again. The emergency management director, with news that would complicate the Harringtons' plans even further. The Coastal Survey team had made a disturbing discovery about the stability of the shoreline beneath what remained of the Harrington Pier. "Subsidence," Dr. Eliza Chen explained, pointing to the soil samples laid out on the conference table. "The accelerated construction timeline didn't allow for proper geological assessment. The Harringtons' contractors built on an unstable section of shoreline that's been slowly eroding for years." The emergency town council meeting had been hastily convened in the high school cafeteria 5 days after the storm. Dr. Chen, a marine geologist from the state university, had been called in to assess the damage and determine whether rebuilding was even possible. In layman's terms, Mayor Wilson asked, "What does this mean for the pier?" Dr. Chen's expression was grave. "It means that rebuilding on the current site would be throwing good money after bad. Any new structure would face the same vulnerabilities, perhaps worse given the erosion the storm accelerated." Richard Harrington, who had insisted on attending despite the meeting being closed to the public, slammed his fist on the table. "This is absurd. We'll bring in our own experts. There's always a solution when you have the right resources. Not everything can be fixed with money, Richard," Maeve Sullivan said quietly from her seat at the far end of the table. As the former town council member who had been most vocally opposed to the privatization, she had been invited to consult during the emergency. "You weren't invited to this meeting," Eleanor Harrington snapped, her usual polished demeanor cracking further. "Actually," the mayor intervened, "Ms. Sullivan is here as our historical compliance officer, a role she's uniquely qualified for given her 30 years of service to this town." Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "If I may continue, there is a silver lining. The original municipal dock site, about 250 yards north of the Harrington Pier, remains structurally sound. The underlying bedrock there provides a much more stable foundation. It's why that dock lasted for 70 years. A murmur went through the room. The original dock had been demolished as part of the privatization agreement, with the Harringtons insisting on building their pier in what they considered a more scenic location. So what are our options? Asked Councilwoman Patrice Delaney. Given the state of emergency, Maeve interjected before the Harringtons could speak, and the findings that the current site is unsuitable for safe public access, I believe Section 27 of our charter applies. Councilwoman Delaney nodded slowly, the safety reassessment clause. What clause? Richard demanded, his face flushing. I've read every line of our agreement. Mayor Wilson picked up a weathered blue binder, the town charter, and read aloud. When infrastructure vital to public access or safety is compromised and cannot be restored in its current form, the town reserves the right to reassess any and all contracts pertaining to said infrastructure. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. That's absurdly vague. It was intentionally written that way after the hurricane of '38, Maeve explained, to ensure the town could adapt to changing coastal conditions without being hamstrung by outdated agreements. The room fell silent as the implications settled over everyone present. Finally, Cal Jenkins, the harbor war master who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. The way I see it, we have two options. Rebuild the Harrington Pier in its current location, knowing it's likely to fail again, or, he paused, looking directly at the Harringtons, we return to the original site and restore a public dock that served this town for generations. You can't just void our contract, Richard sputtered. Actually, the town attorney said, speaking for the first time, under these circumstances, with the emergency declaration and the geological findings, we can. The question becomes whether we should and what that would look like moving forward. As the meeting continued into the evening, the Harringtons grew increasingly isolated. Their vision for an exclusive waterfront enclave was crumbling as quickly as the shoreline beneath their pier. By the time the council called for a preliminary vote, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. 2 weeks later, as Harbor Bay continued its recovery, a different kind of ceremony took place at the site of the original municipal dock. There was no champagne this time, no brass plaques or custom teak benches. Instead, Frank Daniels and his grandson Jake hammered in the first support post for what would become the new Harbor Bay Community Pier. Maeve Sullivan stood nearby, clipboard in hand, overseeing the volunteer effort that had drawn nearly 100 residents. The design was simple but sturdy, incorporating lessons from the old structure while adding modern safety features. You know they're not giving up, Jake said quietly to his grandfather as they paused to wipe sweat from their brows. Eleanor Harrington was at the planning office yesterday, looking for loopholes. Frank nodded toward the water where several boats were anchored, their occupants watching the construction. One sleeve vessel stood out, Richard Harrington's salvaged Hinckley. Let them watch, Frank replied. Some things aren't for sale, no matter how much money you have. On the other side of the construction site, Mayor Wilson approached Maeve with a concerned expression. The Harringtons' lawyer filed for an injunction this morning. Maeve smiled, surprising the mayor. I expected that, but what they don't know is that I've been working with the state's Coastal Preservation Commission. As of yesterday, this entire stretch of shoreline has been designated a protected coastal habitat. The mayor's eyes widened. They can't fight that. They'll try, Maeve acknowledged, but some battles even the Harringtons can't win. As the framework of the new pier took shape against the setting sun, Harbor Bay felt more like itself than it had in months. Children darted between stacks of lumber, volunteers shared thermoses of coffee, and for the first time since the storm, there was laughter along the waterfront. Eleanor Harrington watched from her car parked on the hill above, her expression unreadable. After several minutes, she started the engine and drove away, leaving behind the community she had tried so hard to control, now rebuilding something she had never truly understood, a sense of belonging that no private ownership could ever provide. The Harbor Bay Town Hall had never been so packed. Folding chairs filled every available space, with latecomers standing 3 deep along the walls. The summer air was thick with humidity and tension as Mayor Wilson called the emergency meeting to order. As you all know, he began, we've encountered some obstacles regarding access to our new community pier. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Everyone knew about the Harringtons' roadblock tactics. For the past week, construction equipment had mysteriously appeared each morning, blocking the narrow access road for hours at a time while performing essential maintenance on adjacent Harrington property. Tonight, the mayor continued, we need to vote on authorizing funds to develop an alternative access route using the town's utility corridor. Richard Harrington rose from his seat in the front row. Before we proceed, I'd like to share some concerns about the financial implications of this proposal. For 20 minutes, Richard outlined a series of dire economic predictions, the cost overruns, the environmental permits required, the impact on town taxes. His presentation was slick, backed by colorful charts and professional economic analysis. When he finished, several council members looked noticeably shaken. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, Mayor Wilson said, his voice carefully neutral. Does anyone else wish to speak on this matter? At the back of the room, Jake nudged his grandfather. Frank Daniels hadn't planned to speak, but something about Richard's smug confidence propelled him to his feet. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he made his way to the podium, but his voice was steady. "I'm not much for public speaking," he began, "but I've lived in Harbor Bay for all of my 68 years. My father taught me to fish off that old municipal dock, and I taught my son there too." He paused, glancing at Jake. That dock wasn't just wood and nails. It was where this community came together, where kids learned to swim and old-timers shared stories. Frank shifted his weight, his eyes moving across the familiar faces in the crowd. The Harringtons talk about money, about what things cost, but they never talk about value. What's the value of a place where a kid catches her first fish? What's the value of somewhere everyone can go, regardless of who they are or what they own? He looked directly at Richard. The storm that took your fancy pier wasn't just nature's way of saying you built in the wrong spot. It was a reminder that some things can't be bought or controlled. They belong to everyone or no one at all. Applause broke out as Frank returned to his seat. One by one, other residents stood to speak. The high school science teacher who used the old dock for marine biology lessons, the retired nurse who described how the water access helped her arthritis, the teenager who had proposed a community boat-sharing program for the new pier. As the testimonials continued, Eleanor Harrington leaned toward her husband. "This is getting out of hand," she whispered. "Where's Marcus?" He was supposed to present the legal challenges. Richard checked his watch with growing agitation. Their attorney was now 20 minutes late, unprecedented for the punctual Marcus Whitfield. Across the room, Maeve Sullivan checked her phone and allowed herself a small smile. Marcus was currently trapped in a lengthy discussion with representatives from the state's Coastal Commission and the Attorney General's office regarding certain questionable permits filed during the original privatization process. Mayor Wilson was about to call for a vote when the town hall doors swung open. Avery Harrington walked in, followed by a team of young people in matching green t-shirts emblazoned with Harbor Bay Environmental Coalition. Eleanor half rose from her seat. "Avery, what are you doing here?" Ignoring her mother, Avery approached the podium. "Mr. Mayor, council members, fellow residents, I've spent the past week conducting an ecological survey of both the current access road and the proposed utility corridor route." She signaled to her colleagues, who began distributing folders to the council members. "Our findings are quite clear. The existing road, if expanded as would be necessary to accommodate increased traffic, would irreparably damage the adjacent wetland habitat of the salt marsh sparrow, a species of special concern in our state." Richard's face darkened as he realized what was happening. However, Avery continued, her voice growing stronger, "The utility corridor route, if developed with appropriate environmental safeguards, which our coalition is prepared to help implement, would actually improve drainage conditions and potentially expand viable habitat." She took a deep breath. "As a Harrington, I understand the value of private property. But as an environmental scientist and a Harbor Bay resident, I recognize that some resources transcend ownership. Our coastline is one of them." The room erupted in applause. Richard grabbed his wife's arm. "We're leaving, now." But Eleanor remained seated, her eyes fixed on her daughter. For the first time in weeks, her perfect composure slipped, revealing not anger, but something more complex, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even pride. "No," she said quietly. "I'm staying." Richard stared at her in disbelief before storming out alone. The vote that followed was decisive, 78% in favor of developing the alternative access road. As the meeting adjourned, people gathered in excited clusters, already volunteering for the community work days that would be needed to clear and prepare the new path. In the midst of the celebratory chaos, Eleanor Harrington made her way across the room to where Avery stood with her environmental coalition. "That was quite a presentation," Eleanor said, her voice carefully measured. Avery nodded, expecting recrimination. It was the truth. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, surprising her daughter. It was. She glanced around the room, taking in the community's energy and unity. "Your father and I, we thought we were building something valuable, something lasting." "You were trying to build a legacy," Avery said softly. "But legacy isn't about putting your name on things. It's about what you leave behind that matters to others." Eleanor considered this, then reached into her handbag and withdrew a business card. "Marcus won't be returning as our attorney. He's apparently facing some professional challenges." She handed the card to her daughter. "This is Ann Chen. She specializes in conservation easements and land trusts. Call her tomorrow." Avery looked at the card, then back at her mother in confusion.